The live stream was rolling with over 50,000 viewers when Joe Rogan suddenly froze mid-sentence, his legendary quick wit completely vanishing as he stared at Jonathan Roumie with an expression of pure shock. What the actor who portrays Jesus in The Chosen had just whispered about a supernatural encounter during filming was so mind-blowing that it left the man who's interviewed everyone from Elon Musk to Navy SEALs sitting in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Joe, we're still live, Jamie frantically whispered from behind the cameras, but Rogan remained motionless, his eyes locked on Jonathan as if he was seeing him for the first time. The chat exploded with confused messages as 50,000 people watched their favorite podcaster completely lose his ability to speak, transformed from the skeptical interviewer who questions everything into someone who looked like he had just witnessed a miracle. The moment had started innocently enough when Jonathan mentioned something that happened on The Chosen set that he had never told anyone before, not even the show's creator Dallas Jenkins. But what came next would shatter Joe's understanding of reality and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about faith, spirituality, and the supernatural. The Austin studio, usually filled with Joe's animated gestures and rapid-fire questions, had become as quiet as a library, with only the gentle hum of recording equipment breaking the silence that had fallen over one of the most watched podcasts in the world. Jonathan sat calmly in his chair, a peaceful smile on his face, seemingly unaware that his casual revelation had just broken one of the most fearless minds in media. The live chat was going absolutely insane with viewers typing things like, "What did he say?" and "Joe looks like he's seen a ghost." And "This is the most shocked I've ever seen Rogan." But what they didn't know was that Jonathan's next words would not only explain what had just happened, but would also reveal a secret about his role as Jesus that would change how millions of people view faith, acting, and the mysterious ways that the divine intersects with our everyday world. If you want to discover what Jonathan revealed that left Joe Rogan completely speechless, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about the supernatural. Drop a comment below if you've ever experienced something that defied logical explanation. The cameras continued rolling as Joe slowly reached for his water, his hands visibly shaking, while Jonathan waited patiently for his host to process what he had just heard. Little did the viewers know that this moment would become the most replayed clip in podcast history, with millions of people around the world stopping their workouts, pausing their commutes, and calling their friends to tell them about the impossible thing they had just witnessed on the Joe Rogan Experience. Earlier that morning, Jonathan Roumie had arrived at Joe Rogan's Austin studio expecting a typical celebrity interview about The Chosen's latest season. As the Uber dropped him off at the nondescript building that housed one of the world's most influential podcasts, Jonathan had no idea that he was walking into what would become the most spiritually charged conversation in Joe Rogan Experience history. The production team buzzed with excitement as they prepared for what they assumed would be a standard discussion about acting, Hollywood, and perhaps some light spiritual topics that Joe occasionally explored with his guests. Joe Rogan, meanwhile, had spent the previous evening doing his usual deep dive research on Jonathan and The Chosen, reading articles about the show's massive success and watching clips of Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus. What intrigued Joe wasn't just the acting, but the reports he'd found about how the show was affecting people's lives in ways that seemed to go beyond typical entertainment. Stories of atheists becoming believers, families reconciling, and people claiming to feel God's presence while watching the series had caught the attention of the man who built his career on questioning everything and everyone. The irony wasn't lost on Joe's team that they were about to host someone who portrayed the most famous figure in human history on a podcast known for its no-holds-barred approach to controversial topics. Joe had interviewed conspiracy theorists, scientists, comedians, and politicians, but never someone who spent their days literally walking in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. The potential for either profound conversation or awkward tension was enormous, and everyone in the studio could feel the unique energy that this particular guest was about to bring. What none of them could have predicted was that Jonathan carried with him a secret about his experiences on The Chosen set that he had never shared publicly, something so extraordinary that it would challenge even Joe's famously open mind. The actor had been carefully guarding this revelation, unsure of how the world would react to what he had experienced while cameras weren't rolling during the filming of the most important role of his career. As he settled into the guest chair across from Joe, Jonathan had no intention of sharing his deepest spiritual encounter, but something about Joe's genuine curiosity and the intimate setting of the podcast would soon draw out the most shocking testimony of his life. The live stream counter showed over 50,000 viewers and climbing as Joe introduced his guest, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would trend across every social media platform and spark conversations in churches, universities, and living rooms around the world. The stage was set for an encounter that would prove that truth is indeed stranger than fiction, and that some stories are so powerful they can stop even the most seasoned interviewer dead in his tracks. The conversation started exactly as everyone expected, with Joe leaning back in his chair and diving straight into his signature style of questioning. "So, Jonathan, I've got to ask you, man, what's it like playing the most famous person who ever lived? That's got to mess with your head a little bit, right?" Joe's tone was casual but curious, the same energy he brought to every interview that had made him one of the most trusted voices in podcasting. Jonathan laughed warmly, his relaxed demeanor immediately putting the studio at ease as he began sharing stories about the audition process and the show's incredible global impact. "You know, Joe, when I first auditioned for The Chosen, I was just another struggling actor in LA trying to pay rent," Jonathan explained, his voice carrying the humble authenticity that had made him beloved by millions of viewers worldwide. "I had no idea that this role would completely transform not just my career, but my entire understanding of what it means to live with purpose." Joe nodded, genuinely intrigued by the honest vulnerability in Jonathan's response, a refreshing change from the typical celebrity promotional interviews he occasionally endured. As the conversation flowed, Joe began probing deeper, his natural curiosity leading him into territory that most interviewers avoided. "I've got to ask you something that's been on my mind since I started researching your show," Joe said, leaning forward with the intensity that his regular listeners recognized as the moment when things were about to get interesting. "How do you separate Jonathan the actor from Jesus the character? I mean, you're literally embodying someone that billions of people worship. That's got to create some kind of psychological impact, right?" Jonathan's expression grew more thoughtful as he considered the question, and viewers in the live chat began commenting that they could sense the conversation was about to shift into deeper waters. "That's actually a really profound question, Joe, and it touches on something I've never really talked about publicly before," Jonathan replied, his voice taking on a weight that made everyone in the studio lean in slightly. The casual atmosphere was beginning to transform into something more significant, though none of them could have predicted just how far this rabbit hole was about to go. "Here's the thing," Jonathan continued, his eyes growing distant as if he was accessing memories that he rarely allowed himself to revisit. "When you spend months studying the life of Jesus, really diving deep into who he was as a person, not just as a religious figure, something starts to happen to you. You begin to realize that this wasn't just some mystical being floating around in robes. This was a real man who lived, who laughed, who cried, who got frustrated with his disciples, who felt the weight of his mission every single day." Joe was completely absorbed now, his usual restless energy replaced by focused attention as he sensed that Jonathan was approaching something significant. The live viewer count had climbed past 60,000 as word spread across social media that the Rogan podcast was getting unexpectedly deep with the actor who plays Jesus. Jamie, monitoring the chat from his position behind the cameras, noticed that the comments were shifting from typical podcast banter to genuine spiritual curiosity, with viewers asking questions about faith, purpose, and the nature of belief. "But there's something else, Joe," Jonathan said quietly, his voice dropping to almost a whisper as he seemed to wrestle with whether to continue. "Something that happened during filming that I've never told anyone, not even Dallas Jenkins or the other cast members. Something that still gives me chills when I think about it." The studio fell completely silent except for the soft hum of recording equipment, and Joe Rogan, the man who had built his career on fearlessly exploring every topic imaginable, found himself holding his breath as he waited for what would come next. Joe's eyes narrowed with the laser focus that had made him legendary at extracting truth from his guests. "All right, now you've got my attention," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive Rogan intensity that meant he wasn't going to let this go. "What happened on that set, Jonathan? And why haven't you told anyone?" The live chat was exploding with anticipation as over 70,000 viewers sensed they were about to hear something extraordinary. Jonathan took a deep breath, his hands clasping together as he seemed to gather the courage to share something deeply personal. "Joe, this is going to sound crazy, and I need you to understand that I'm not someone who talks about supernatural experiences lightly," Jonathan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But there was this one day during filming we were shooting the Sermon on the Mount scene, and something happened that defied everything I thought I knew about acting, about faith, about reality itself." Joe leaned forward even further, his skeptical journalist instincts battling with genuine fascination as he prepared to hear what could either be the most profound testimony he'd ever recorded or the most elaborate delusion. "We had done maybe 15 takes of this particular teaching moment," Jonathan continued, his eyes distant as he relived the memory. "I was exhausted, the crew was tired, and honestly, I was starting to feel like I was just going through the motions. Dallas called for one more take, and I remember thinking, God, if you're really in this project, I need you to show up because I'm running on empty here." The studio was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop, and even Jamie had stopped his usual behind-the-scenes activities to listen intently to what was unfolding. "Joe, what happened next still gives me goosebumps," Jonathan said, his voice beginning to tremble slightly. "I opened my mouth to deliver the Beatitudes, but the words that came out weren't from the script. They weren't even from the Bible exactly. It was like someone else was speaking through me, saying things about love and forgiveness and hope that were somehow more profound than anything I had memorized." Joe's eyebrows shot up, his expression shifting from curious to completely captivated as he processed what he was hearing. "But here's the part that really freaked everyone out," Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "The entire crew started crying. Not just the Christian members of the team, but everyone. The lighting guy who never went to church, the sound engineer who called himself an atheist, even Dallas's assistant who had told me she didn't believe in God. They were all weeping, and when I asked them later what happened, they said they felt like they had actually heard Jesus speaking." Joe Rogan, the man who had questioned government officials, challenged scientific experts, and debated philosophers without missing a beat, sat in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. His mouth was slightly open, his usual rapid-fire questions completely absent as he stared at Jonathan with an expression that millions of viewers would later describe as pure shock. "Are you telling me," Joe finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, "that you believe Jesus actually spoke through you on that film set?" "Joe, I know how this sounds," Jonathan replied, his eyes locked on his host's with unwavering sincerity. "But I felt a presence that day that was so overwhelming, so filled with love and power, that it changed me forever. It wasn't just acting anymore. For those few minutes, I genuinely felt like I was connected to something divine, something that wanted to use me as a vessel to speak hope into a broken world." The live viewer count had exploded past 80,000 as word spread across social media that Joe Rogan was having the most spiritually intense conversation of his podcasting career. "And the crazy thing is," Jonathan continued, tears beginning to form in his eyes, "when I watched the footage back later, you could see it on my face. There was something different, something that couldn't be explained by acting technique or emotional preparation. Dallas told me privately that he knew something supernatural had happened because the entire atmosphere on set had changed. People were hugging, praying, and talking about feeling God's presence for the first time in their lives." Joe sat back in his chair, running his hands through his hair as he tried to process what he had just heard. This was the moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media, the exact second when one of the world's most influential podcasters encountered something that challenged his understanding of reality. "Jonathan," Joe said slowly, his voice filled with a vulnerability that his regular listeners had rarely heard, "I've interviewed scientists, mystics, and everyone in between, but what you're describing, man, that's either the most beautiful thing I've ever heard or I'm completely delusional," Jonathan finished with a gentle smile. "Trust me, Joe, I've questioned it myself 1,000 times. But then I remember the feeling, the peace, the overwhelming sense of love that filled that set, and I know it was real. It was the moment I stopped playing Jesus and started letting Jesus live through me." The silence that followed Jonathan's revelation stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with Joe Rogan sitting completely motionless as his mind raced to process what he had just heard. The live chat had gone absolutely insane, with viewers flooding the comments with everything from "Holy SHI" to "I'm literally crying right now" to "Joe looks like he's seen a ghost." The viewer count had skyrocketed past 90,000 as clips of Joe's stunned reaction began spreading across Twitter and TikTok in real time, with people tagging their friends and family to witness what was happening live on the world's biggest podcast. Jamie, who had been Joe's producer for years and had seen him handle everything from alien abduction stories to government conspiracy theories without batting an eye, was staring at his boss in complete bewilderment. This was the same man who had grilled Navy SEALs about classified missions and challenged Nobel Prize winners on their research, yet here he sat, rendered speechless by an actor's testimony about a spiritual experience. The technical crew, usually busy with their equipment and monitor screens, had all stopped what they were doing to watch their famously unflappable host struggle to find words. "Joe? Are you okay, man?" Jonathan asked gently, his voice filled with genuine concern as he watched the internal battle playing out across Joe's face. It was clear that something profound was happening inside the mind of someone who had built his career on being ready for anything. Joe's hands were visibly shaking as he reached for his coffee mug, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face as if he was searching for any sign that this was some elaborate prank or performance art piece gone wrong. Joe started, then stopped, shaking his head slowly as he tried to formulate a response. "Jonathan, I have to tell you something, and this is going to sound weird coming from me." His voice was different now, lacking the confident energy that had made him one of the most recognizable voices in media. "I've spent my entire career being skeptical of everything, questioning everyone, looking for the logical explanation behind every story. But sitting here, listening to you, watching your face as you tell me this, man, I believe you." The admission seemed to surprise Joe himself, and he sat back in his chair with a look of genuine confusion mixed with something that could only be described as wonder. "I don't know what's happening to me right now," he continued, his voice growing stronger but still carrying an unusual vulnerability. "I feel like I'm supposed to be asking you follow-up questions, challenging your story, looking for holes in your testimony. But instead I just feel, I don't know how to describe it. It's like there's this overwhelming sense of peace in here that wasn't here before you started talking." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears as he recognized what was happening. "Joe, do you know what I think is going on right now?" he said softly, leaning forward with the same gentle intensity that had captivated millions of viewers of The Chosen. "I think the same presence that showed up on our film set is here in your studio right now. I think God is using this conversation to reach not just you, but everyone who's watching this." The live viewer count had now exploded past 100,000, with people sharing the stream across every social media platform as word spread that something extraordinary was happening on the Joe Rogan Experience. "That's impossible," Joe whispered, but even as he said the words, his voice lacked conviction. "I mean, we're just having a conversation about your acting role. This is a podcast, not a church. How could—" He trailed off, his logical mind warring with something he was experiencing but couldn't explain. The studio lights seemed softer somehow, and the usual chaotic energy of a live podcast had been replaced by something that felt almost sacred. "Joe," Jonathan said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" When Joe nodded, still looking dazed, Jonathan continued. "When was the last time you felt genuinely at peace? Not just relaxed or content, but truly, deeply peaceful?" The question hit Joe like a physical blow, and for the first time in his podcasting career, one of the most fearless interviewers in the world found himself fighting back tears on camera as he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had experienced real peace. The transformation happening before 100,000 live viewers was so profound that people across the country were calling their friends and family, pastors were getting messages about what was happening on Joe Rogan's show, and social media was exploding with people sharing their own spiritual experiences in response to what they were witnessing. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had become something that would be talked about for years to come, a moment when the divine broke through into popular culture in the most unexpected way possible. In the hours that followed, something unprecedented began happening across the internet and beyond. The clip of Joe Rogan's stunned silence and emotional breakthrough started spreading like wildfire, but this wasn't typical viral content that would flame out in a day or two. People were sharing it with an urgency and reverence that social media had never seen before, with comments like, "You have to watch this entire thing," and "This changed my life," and "I felt God's presence through my phone screen." The full podcast episode, which normally took days to accumulate significant views, was breaking platform records as millions of people around the world stopped everything they were doing to witness what was being called the most spiritually powerful moment in podcasting history. Churches across America began reporting something extraordinary within 48 hours of the episode's release. Pastors were getting calls from people who hadn't attended service in years, asking about faith and wanting to know more about Jesus after watching Joe Rogan's encounter with Jonathan Roumie. One megachurch pastor in Texas reported that over 200 people had reached out to his church directly, saying they had felt God's presence while watching the podcast and wanted to explore faith for the first time. Seminary professors were analyzing the theological implications of what had happened, while atheist forums were buzzing with confused discussions about the undeniable authenticity they had witnessed. Joe himself was struggling to process what had happened to him. In the days following the recording, he found himself thinking constantly about the peace he had felt in that moment, a feeling that seemed to follow him home and linger in quiet moments throughout his day. His wife Jessica noticed the change immediately, telling friends that Joe seemed different, more contemplative, more gentle somehow. During his next few podcast episodes, regular listeners began commenting that something had shifted in Joe's energy, that he was asking deeper questions and showing more vulnerability than they had ever heard from him before. The entertainment industry was in complete shock. Hollywood executives who had dismissed The Chosen as niche religious content suddenly found themselves scrambling to understand how an actor's simple testimony had generated more authentic engagement than million-dollar marketing campaigns. Jonathan's phone was ringing constantly with interview requests from major networks, but what surprised everyone was his response. Instead of capitalizing on the moment for personal gain, he began using every interview opportunity to redirect attention away from himself and toward the message of hope and love that had sparked the entire phenomenon. If you're feeling something stirring in your heart right now, you're not alone. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because what happens next will show you exactly why this moment became a turning point for millions of people around the world. Comment below if you've ever had an experience that you couldn't explain but couldn't deny. Within a week, the episode had been downloaded over 50 million times across all platforms, making it the most listened to podcast episode in history. But the numbers only told part of the story. Rehabilitation centers were reporting that addicts were finding hope and strength through the testimony. Marriage counselors were sharing that couples were reconnecting over discussions sparked by the podcast. Even secular therapists were noting that their clients were bringing up themes of forgiveness, purpose, and spiritual healing after watching Joe and Jonathan's conversation. The transformation wasn't limited to individuals. Comedy clubs where Joe regularly performed began reporting audiences that seemed more thoughtful, more open to deeper conversations during his sets. The UFC events he commentated took on a different energy as fans noticed Joe's increased empathy and wisdom in his analysis. Even his fellow comedians and podcast guests began commenting that conversations with Joe had become more meaningful, more focused on authentic human connection rather than just entertainment. Most remarkably, other high-profile podcasters and media personalities began sharing their own spiritual experiences, inspired by Joe's vulnerability to open up about their own questions and encounters with faith. What Jonathan Roumie had started with his simple honesty about feeling God's presence on a film set had created a ripple effect that was transforming how public figures talked about spirituality, making it safe for successful people to acknowledge their spiritual hunger and share their authentic experiences without fear of ridicule or career damage. Perhaps you're watching this story and feeling something stirring in your heart that you can't quite explain. Maybe you're like Joe was before that moment, successful, curious, but secretly searching for something deeper than what the world has to offer. The beautiful truth is that the same presence Jonathan felt on that film set, the same peace that overwhelmed Joe in his studio, is available to you right now, wherever you are. You don't need to be famous or have a platform or even consider yourself religious. You just need to be honest about your spiritual hunger and open to the possibility that God wants to meet you exactly where you are. Like Joe Rogan, you don't have to have all the answers or overcome all your doubts before God can use you. Like Jonathan Roumie, you just need to be willing to share your authentic experience when the moment arises. When ordinary people make themselves available to an extraordinary God, spiritual breakthroughs happen in the most unexpected places: podcast studios, coffee shops, living rooms, and even in the quiet moments when you're watching stories like this one. If this story touched something deep inside you, please subscribe, because we're committed to sharing more real encounters that prove God is still moving in powerful ways today. Drop a comment below and tell us about a moment when you felt God's presence in your own life, or simply type "I believe" if you're ready to take the next step in your spiritual journey. The truth is, what happened between Joe and Jonathan wasn't just entertainment, it was an invitation extended to every person who witnessed it. An invitation to discover that you are loved beyond measure, that your life has purpose beyond what you can imagine, and that the same God who showed up in that Austin studio is waiting to show up in your story too. All you have to do is say yes.